Hello, and welcome to our lecture on semiconductors. In this lecture, we go from tubes to transistors and semiconductors. So transistors were something that was discovered at Bell Labs in the quest to build a better triode. They were trying to build a better tube. And there are three basic kinds of materials with respect to electricity. There are conductors, like metal. This is a wire. Inside the wire is metal. Then there are insulators, like plastic. The outside of this wire is plastic. That's why if there's electricity inside the wire, you can grab it by the plastic because the plastic insulates you. But for transistors, there's this thing called a semiconductor, and it's certain crystalline materials, like silicon, that can be modified by adding certain impurities. They call that doping. So these conduct electricity under certain conditions, and hence they call them semiconductors, sometimes conductors. Here's the basic picture of a Nobel Prize. You can create a transistor by taking some silicon with a particular kind of doping and a silicon with different and touching them. And so when voltages are applied to these crystals, subatomic stuff happens at the boundary that allows electricity to flow from one to the other. So it's actually at the boundaries, right? So when these two kinds of material touch, that's what creates the transistor. And in the early days, it was a quest to take an input and a voltage and make an amplified output. And so it turned out that transistors kind of did that, but you couldn't do what one tube did in a single transistor. And it turns out that the single transistor can be used to amplify, but it then flips the signal, and you got to unflip the signal back up. And if you look at it, it's not quite as high a quality as a tube, so you add a couple more transistors, then a diode here and there, and a capacitor to affect to make sure that any large DC voltages don't go through, etc., and some resistors. And you add all that stuff up, and you can make a pretty decent amplifier at that point out of transistors that you would have done originally with one tube. And so one of the first things that I saw coming out were transistor radios. And so what was a radio? Well, it used to be something that sat in your house, and you turned knobs and whatever, and you went to the store and bought tubes when the tubes broke down. But a portable radio, if you could use transistors, they were much smaller, and you could have a portable battery-powered transistor radio. Transistors were so exotic that in the early marketing of some of these radios, they told you how many transistors was in the radio. So here is a Sony 8-transistor radio. And if you look closely, you can see it says 8 transistors. Now let's turn this on, see what we're going to get. This is the only radio station that I could get inside this room, etc. But that is real AM live radio that is coming to this radio and being amplified by transistors. So let's take a look at what's inside this. So now we have the back off of it, and you can see here some transistors, some capacitors, and some resistors, just like what was on that circuit. So you can see these ones that have kind of they're round and they have a little outline on top. Those are capacitors. So it has, 3, 4, 5, 6 capacitors. They're used to filter out sort of high transient voltages. And then there's the transistors are these there's the little things that don't have a circle on the top. They're little metal. You can take a look at the side of them to see how the transistors are built. Right there is a transistor. And then there's some resistors. You can kind of hard to see them. They're kind of tucked in between things. And so we have, I don't know, I can count like 1, 2. Well, there's 8 transistors because that's what it said it did. And so this is what's inside of it. It used explicit transistors, and it was able to create a radio. This top bit right here, that is the antenna for the radio. And so there you go, an 8-transistor radio, probably from the 1960s, that still works today. So for a while, it seemed like transistors were magic, and everything that used to be done by tubes was just slowly but surely replaced by transistors. The power was lower, everything lasted longer, you didn't have to worry about replacing the tubes. But then what happened is, if you look at the complexity of that circuit, you find that there's too many things in that circuit, and purists who want perfect audio replication feel like so many transistors and resistors and capacitors introduce noise. And so there, in recent years, there has been sort of a throwback to tube-based amplifiers. And so you can buy these things. A brand new one can be over 50,000, and some of them are much higher than that. And so part of the reason is that if you compare and contrast a single tube with a bunch of circuitry, you can see how it might have some advantages. So I'll leave it up to the audiophiles to decide which is better. Also, high-end musicians tend to like amps that have tubes in them because they feel that they give a more pure sound. Before we completely leave tubes and say goodbye and moved on to transistors for the rest of the class, I want to show you one last tube. It's called a Nixie tube. And it's going to appear later in the class when we do some digital circuit design. This Nixie tube is a tube that has glowing numbers, and you can see in the back I have a working what we call Nixie tube clock. And I just want to show it to you to show how these numbers have sort of a dimensionality when they're moving forwards and backwards. But what I like about the whole thing is I want to just show you the glow, right? That there's a certain glow and prettiness about tubes, and those are electrons that are making the shapes that glow. And I can kind of understand why it is that people who love audio love tubes, because not only can you listen to the audio, but you can also watch the tubes as a almost living analog creature doing your amplification. This is not a high-end audio class, but this is kind of where we're going to take our leave of tubes and move forward into a transistor-only world. So the first thing, this is a graph that shows input voltage versus output voltage. And so you could think of the input voltage as something we're driving on the horizontal axis. And much like when we talked about making digital tubes, the earliest kind of transistor was an amplifier style transistor, and it had a very much like a tube response in that it had a nice gradual slope, because you wanted the amplification of all the different frequencies and intensities of music to kind of be consistent as you turn the volume up and down. But digital transistors, like digital tubes, wanted to have a shorter transition. So again, you see this. Now I'll point out that this is flipped from the tube one, because when a transistor is doing amplification, it kind of inverts it first, and that's why we had to put extra transistors in to make a real amplifier. But the picture's kind of the same. You want, for a digital transistor, you want it to have a quick transition from high to low in terms of the output. So as the input voltage is increased, you want it, high, 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 then snap, low, as fast as possible. The other thing you want is a regeneration thing. So you want it to kind of come down about 1/3 of the input voltage. And so that way that you have, if you put these in a sequence from one to the other, you're kind of regenerating the one and dealing with that sort of indeterminate state between 0 and 1. And so these are just designed slightly differently with different impurities and different silicon and different manufacturing techniques. So over time, there was a couple of different kinds of transistors. One was the transistor called NMOS, which conducts with the input gate is high, and the PMOS that conducts with the input is low. And the most modern chips use a combination of NMOS and PMOS transistors. As a matter of fact, there are 4 general areas of transistor manufacturing and usage. So the earliest was the bipolar junction transistor, which is more like a tube with that kind of linear response. They were fast and they knew how to make them in the early days, but they were power hungry and hard to integrate. And then what we did is we made PMOS transistors, which were kind of large and clunky, but they were easier to put together with early manufacturing imperfections, and they were slow. And then we switched to NMOS, faster and simpler. But both PMOS and NMOS by themselves wasted power. And about 1983, and like the Intel 486, we switched to what's called CMOS, complementary metal on silicon. And it was very low power, and it was very scalable. And really, from 1983 till now, we have pretty much used CMOS. And it really has to do with improving manufacturing over time. So There's a whole bunch of different eras of manufacturing for transistors, and we built computers throughout that whole era. But today we do CMOS transistor technology. We'll talk about that in the next section.